March 1st, 1943, Port Moresby. Major Ed Larner stares at a Japanese convoy hauling 7,000 troops, an impossible target. High-altitude bombing can't hit moving ships, and the losses keep rising. So he bets everything on a banned tactic fly, a B-25 at 50 feet rake decks with .50 caliber fire, and skip a 1,000-pound bomb into the hull. One pass. One chance. Chaos follows. At 6:30 on March 1st, 1943, Port Moresby was drowning in rain, the kind that soaked through boots and settled into your bones. On the coral runway, Major Ed Larner stood still watching 9 B-25 Mitchell bombers cough to life. 31 years old, 72 combat missions, 0 ships sunk. Not because he lacked skill, but because the math of war was beating him every time. Out over the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese were moving again. 8 troop transports, 8 destroyers, nearly 7,000 soldiers sailing from Rabaul toward Leh. American intelligence had intercepted the departure, and everyone understood what it meant. Every transport that reached New Guinea would become months of jungle fighting. More graves cut into mud, more blood traded for ground measured in yards. For 8 months, the 5th Air Force had tried to stop convoys like this, the right-way high-altitude bombing from 10,000 feet, and it wasn't working. A 1,000-pound bomb took 37 seconds to fall. In 37 seconds, a destroyer, at flank speed, could move hundreds of yards. Japanese captains watched the bombers climb calculated trajectories and calmly turned away. Bombs hit water, ships sailed on. The numbers were merciless. Hit rate 3%. Bomber losses climbing fast. Japanese gunners loved high-altitude attacks. They had time to track time, to lead time to bracket formations with flak. By the time bombs fell, aircraft were already burning. Larner's squadron alone had lost 4 bombers in a month. 40 men gone. No ships sunk. General George Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, had proposed a solution that sounded insane to everyone. One who flew. Don't drop bombs, skip them. Fly straight at the ships at 50 feet. Release at 300 yards. Let the bomb bounce across the water and slam into the hull before detonating under the waterline. Theorists said it could work. Pilots said it was suicide. Flying a twin-engine bomber at wave-top height into a wall of anti-aircraft fire violated every survival instinct Larner had. Japanese destroyers bristled with guns 127mm main batteries, 25mm cannons, machine guns everywhere. One solid hit to an engine, and a B-25 would cartwheel into the sea before the crew could even react. High command had banned the tactic. Twice. Too dangerous. Too experimental. Reckless disregard for men and machines. But high-altitude bombing wasn't sinking ships. And at dawn, with the rain pounding the runway and engines warming behind him, Larner understood something with cold clarity. If those transports reached Leh, the war in New Guinea would grind on for another year. He had 3 hours to prepare. 3 hours to teach his pilots to fly like they never had before. And 1 chance to prove that an impossible idea was the only one left. Larner stepped into the operations tent and spread the reconnaissance photos across the table. The Japanese convoy was clean and unmistakable, 2 neat columns of fat transports destroyers guarding the flanks like attack dogs. Every ship was packed with soldiers, artillery ammunition. If even half of them reached Leh, the campaign in New Guinea would turn into a grinding, bloody stalemate. This was the moment Larner made his decision. The B-25 Mitchell had never been designed for what he was about to ask. It was a medium bomber built to fly steady and level drop bombs from altitude and turn for home. But Kenny's mechanics had changed the aircraft into something new and something dangerous. The glass nose was gone. In its place, 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in the nose, 4 in side blisters. When they opened up, the upgraded aircraft could throw a wall of lead that forced even veteran gunners to duck or die. The theory was brutally simple. You couldn't dodge flak if the gunners never had time to aim. Larner had watched the modifications go on weeks earlier. The extra guns' added weight shifted the balance forward and turned the B-25 into a hybrid part, bomber part attack aircraft, something that had no rulebook, no doctrine, no safety margin. The practice runs had been done in secret. At dawn and dusk, crews skimmed the wave tops toward a rusting wreck half submerged on a reef. They learned what 50 feet really looked like. They learned how fast 270 miles per hour felt when the ocean filled the windscreen. And they learned how unforgiving the margins were. Get it wrong and the bomb skipped too far. Get it wrong and it detonated harmlessly. Get it wrong and you flew straight through your own blast. One crew got it right once. Low, fast, close. The bomb skipped and slammed into the hull just below the waterline, exactly where ammunition and fuel lived. Exactly where one explosion could tear a ship apart. Now it wouldn't be a wreck shooting back. Larner gathered his squadron leaders and laid out the plan they had been forbidden to practice. Each pilot got one target, one pass only. No second chances, no circling back. Transports first. Destroyers only if the transports were already burning. The approach parameters were unforgiving 50 feet above the water. 270 miles per hour. Release at 300 yards. 5-second delay fuse. Miss one number and you wasted the bomb or your life. At 700, the crews walked to their aircraft. 54 men climbed into 9 B-25s knowing exactly what was coming. Ahead of them, Australian bow fighters would rake the convoy. Above them, heavy bombers would force evasive maneuvers. Fighters would keep the enemy busy at altitude. But the real killing would be done low, so low that radar couldn't see them and waves slapped the fuselage. At 7:45, Larner pushed the throttles forward and released the brakes. By mid-morning, he would know whether skip bombing was madness or whether it was about to change the Pacific War forever. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 90 minutes, and every second of it was spent just above disaster. Larner kept his B-25 at wavetop height 30 feet above the ocean, so low that salt spray occasionally splattered the windshield. Any lower, and the propellers would chew water. Any higher, and Japanese radar might see them. This was the narrow corridor where survival lived. The 9 bombers flew in a loose V spaced far enough apart that one burst of flak couldn't kill them all at once. No radio calls, no chatter. One transmission, and the convoy would know death was coming. Surprise was the only advantage they had. At 8:52, Larner saw it black smoke smudging the horizon. Diesel exhaust. Too much of it to be patrol boats. 16 ships right where intelligence said they'd be. The Japanese convoy came into focus, 2 columns of transports destroyers, guarding the edges like steel sharks. Every one of those hulls was full of soldiers who thought they were untouchable at sea. Larner keyed his throat mic once. Click. His wingmen answered with clicks of their own. Formation tightened, Targets were seconds away. At 08:57, the Australians struck first. 13 bowfighters dove in their cannons, raking the decks. Tracers stitched across destroyers. Gun crews ducked. Weapons swung toward the new threat, exactly as planned. Then the heavy bombers arrived overhead. Bomb bay doors opened. Bombs fell. The Japanese reacted instantly. Hard turns, broken columns. White water boiling behind accelerating destroyers. The convoy dissolved into confusion. Larner pushed the throttles and dropped lower, 40 feet, airspeed steady. His bombardier's voice cut through the roar of engines, calling distances as the nearest transport swelled in the windscreen. Individual men were visible now, tiny figures scrambling on deck, running straight into the teeth of what was coming. The first Japanese shells arced toward them, too high. The gunners were used to altitude. They hadn't adjusted yet. At 2,000 yards, Larner opened fire. 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted at once, hammering the ship's superstructure. Glass shattered, metal sparked, gun positions vanished in clouds of debris. The transport was alive with panicked men diving for cover instead of firing back. 800 yards. The destroyers finally found the range. Shells bracketed the formation, concussions rocking the aircraft. Shrapnel rattled against aluminum skin. Oil pressure flickered on Larner's port engine, but it held. 600 yards. Every instinct screamed to pull up, to climb, to live. Larner ignored it. 400 yards. Bomb armed. 300. He pressed the release. The B-25 jumped as the 1,000-pound bomb dropped free. It struck the water, skipped once like a stone, and vanished into the side of the transport at the waterline. Larner hauled back on the controls, climbing hard. The explosion hit like a fist. The shockwave kicked the bomber sideways as fire and black smoke erupted behind him. The transport split open, secondary explosions ripping through its belly. Soldiers poured over the sides into the sea. One bomb, one pass. Catastrophic damage. To Larner's left and right, other ships were already burning. A destroyer lost its stern. Another transport erupted in flames. But the Japanese were adapting fast. A shell found its mark. One B-25 disintegrated in mid-air, erased in a heartbeat. No parachutes, no survivors. There was no time to mourn. The attack was still underway, and the air above the convoy was turning into metal and fire. The convoy was dying, but it wasn't helpless. As burning transports slowed and began to list, the Japanese destroyers reacted with brutal speed. They turned inward, forming a moving wall of steel. Every gun that could still fire now aimed low. The ocean around the B-25s erupted with shell splashes, tall white pillars marking where death had almost arrived a second too late. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett pulled up from his run, his target already engulfed in flame. To Larner's other side, Captain Bill Hayes went after a destroyer. His bomb skipped twice and struck beneath the aft turret. The explosion lifted the stern clear out of the water. When it slammed back down, the rear third of the ship was simply gone. 4 ships hit in less than 90 seconds. Then the price came due. A destroyer on the far flank locked onto Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first shell missed. The second walked closer. The third connected. Mitchell's aircraft vanished in a flash bomb, detonating instantly. 5 men were gone before their bodies could even register fear. The surviving bombers pressed on anyway. This was the unforgiving truth of skip bombing. Once committed, there was no turning away. Pull up too early and you wasted the bomb. Stay on course and you flew straight into concentrated fire. Courage wasn't optional. It was mandatory. Another B-25 took hits through the wing fuel streaming into the slipstream. The pilot held steady, released at barely 150 yards, then banked away, trailing fire. The flames died. The bomber staggered but stayed airborne. 6 transports were now burning or sinking. 2 destroyers were crippled. The attack had lasted barely 4 minutes, and the Japanese convoy was already wreckage. Then came the next threat. At 9:15, silver shapes dropped out of the clouds, Japanese Zeros, 18 of them diving fast. The P-38s were supposed to keep them occupied. Something had gone wrong. Larner shoved the throttles forward and dove even lower, skimming 15 feet above the waves. Tracers tore past the cockpit. His dorsal gunner fired short, disciplined bursts, forcing 1-0 to break away. Another stayed glued to a damaged bomber ahead. The Zero pilot waited patiently. When the American aircraft bled off speed, he fired. The engine exploded. The bomber cartwheeled into the sea. 3 parachutes blossomed. 2 didn't. The Zeros hunted for minutes, then suddenly pulled up and climbed away. Larner realized why as heavy bombers returned overhead. The Japanese fighters had to choose defend what was left of the convoy or finish off the bombers below. They chose the bigger threat. Larner took stock. His aircraft was damaged. Fuel was low. 1 engine was running rough. But below him, the convoy was finished. 8 transports had been hit. 7 were sinking or already gone. The last burned limping toward shore. The destroyers were wrecks, some dead in the water, others desperately trying to rescue survivors. The impossible mission had worked. As Larner turned for home, he understood something that would echo far beyond the Bismarck Sea. Skip bombing wasn't just a tactic anymore. It was a revolution written in fire, paid for in lives, and proven at 50 feet above the ocean. The flight home was quieter than the battle, but far more dangerous. Larner's B-25 limped south, scattered formations stretching across 30 miles of empty ocean. His port engine vibrated, oil pressure rising and falling like a dying pulse. Fuel gauges sank towards 0. He ordered the crew to dump anything that wasn't essential: ammunition, spare parts, tools, watching thousands of pounds fall into the sea just to stay airborne. Behind them, the Bismarck Sea was littered with fire and wreckage. The convoy had sailed with 16 ships. By the time the smoke thinned, 14 were either sunk or sinking. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were in the water, clinging to debris lifeboats, anything that floated. For 3 days, Allied aircraft and patrol boats returned again and again. No reinforcements were allowed to reach Leh. None. The line between combat and annihilation disappeared out there. Larner didn't see most of it. He was focused on one thing: getting his damaged aircraft back to Port Moresby before the engine seized. When the New Guinea coastline finally appeared, his port engine was shaking violently, oil streaming from the cowling. He feathered the prop, shifted all power to the remaining engine, and coaxed the B-25 forward at barely above stall speed. At 11:17, the wheels hit coral. Larner shut down the engines and sat in silence, hands locked on the controls. 3 hours and 42 minutes in the air. It felt like a lifetime. Around him, mechanics and intelligence officers were already running toward the aircraft. Word had spread fast. The debrief lasted 2 hours. How many bombs released? How many hits? How many aircraft lost? 5 of the 9 original bombers had returned. 4 were gone. 13 airmen dead, others wounded. Then the reconnaissance photos arrived. They told the story better than words ever could. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk or crippled. Nearly an entire Japanese reinforcement force erased before it touched land. General George Kenny arrived that afternoon, studied the photographs, and gave a single order: finish it. A final strike went in at dusk. The last transport was sunk at its moorings. The remaining destroyers were hunted down as they tried to escape. By nightfall, the operation that was supposed to save New Guinea had become one of the worst naval disasters in Japanese history. The strategic impact was immediate. Japanese commanders canceled large convoy operations within range of Allied aircraft. Supply lines withered. Isolated garrisons starved. The war in the Pacific shifted quietly permanently. Skip bombing had been called suicide. Then it was called genius. The truth was simpler. It worked because men like Larner flew straight at destroyers at 50 feet while the air turned solid with steel. And once that door was opened, naval warfare would never close it again. The war didn't pause to celebrate what had happened over the Bismarck Sea. It studied it. Within weeks, skip bombing stopped being a forbidden experiment and became doctrine. Armor was added around cockpits. Engines were shielded. More guns were bolted onto B-25s until some carried so much forward firepower they looked less like bombers and more like flying execution squads. Crews were trained to do one thing perfectly: hold a straight course while the sky tried to kill them. And it worked again and again. Japanese commanders learned fast. They added more anti-aircraft guns. They trained gunners to track low to fire early, to concentrate everything on the bomber that couldn't maneuver once committed. When convoys sailed with fighter cover and open ocean to maneuver skip, bombing became a knife fight where everyone bled. When ships were trapped near coastlines and harbors, in narrow seas, it was devastating. The numbers told only part of the story. Ships sank at rates high-altitude bombing could never touch. Supply lines collapsed. Garrisons withered without food or ammunition. Islands fell not because they were stormed, but because they were starved. The human cost stayed mostly unspoken. Skip bombing demanded something different from air crews. It wasn't about altitude or precision instruments. It was about nerve, about flying straight at a wall of guns and refusing to blink. Crews who flew these missions broke faster. Combat fatigue came sooner. Tours were shorter. Casualty rates were brutal even by wartime standards. Larner understood that better than anyone. He never flew another skip bombing mission after May 1943. Instead, he trained new crews. He watched young pilots climb into aircraft carrying tactics he had helped prove, and watched some of them not come back. When offered continued combat command, he declined. He transferred to transport aircraft, hauling supplies instead of bombs. No glory, no headlines, just distance. He never explained the decision. He didn't have to. After the war, skip bombing was written into manuals taught in classrooms, analyzed in staff colleges. Credit went to generals and doctrines. The men who flew at 50 feet rarely spoke. The aircraft they flew were worn out, scrapped, melted down. No monuments marked the places where entire convoys vanished beneath the sea. Larner lived the rest of his life quietly. When he died decades later, his obituary mentioned his service in a single line. Nothing about the battle, nothing about the tactic that helped choke an empire's supply lines. That silence wasn't accidental. Some victories are too close, too violent, too personal to revisit. Skip bombing changed naval warfare, but it also showed the price of innovation under desperation. It proved that when the old rules fail, new ones are written by people willing to fly into fire and accept whatever comes next. Over the Bismarck Sea, they didn't just sink ships. They changed how wars were fought and carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives. History loves clean victories. Reality never gives them. 3 months after the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese came back with a lesson learned in blood. Another convoy formed at Rabaul, fewer transports, more destroyers, heavier guns, constant fighter cover. This time, they sailed at night. This time, every deck bristled with extra 20mm cannons, all trained low. They knew what 50 feet meant now. At dawn, American reconnaissance spotted them. The 5th Air Force answered the only way it knew how. 12 B-25s went in using skip bombing. The result was nothing like March. 2 transports were hit. 1 destroyer was damaged. 3 American bombers were shot out of the sky. Crews that survived reported the same thing again and again. The Japanese gunners were ready. They fired early. They tracked low. They waited until the bombers were committed, then poured everything into the approach corridor. Skip bombing still worked, but it no longer worked cheaply. The response was immediate. Armor plates appeared around cockpits and engines. More guns were added until some B-25s carried 14 forward-firing .50 calibers. Suppression became overwhelming by design. If the gunners couldn't see, couldn't aim, couldn't breathe, the bomber might live long enough to release. By November 1943, the tactic reached its peak. 38 B-25s attacked Rabaul Harbor itself. Warships, auxiliaries, merchant vessels, targets trapped with nowhere to maneuver. The raid lasted 18 minutes. 1 heavy cruiser sunk, a destroyer destroyed, dozens of ships damaged or burning. American losses: 2 aircraft. The lesson was brutal and precise. Skip bombing was devastating in confined waters, deadly in harbors, lethal in narrow seas. In open ocean against prepared escorts in fighter cover, it was a gamble measured in lives. Other nations took note. The British used it against German convoys off Norway, trading high losses for real results. The Soviets tried it in the Black Sea and Baltic, sometimes successful, often catastrophic. Training, coordination, and suppression made the difference between innovation and slaughter. By war's end, the statistics were undeniable. Skip bombing sank or crippled hundreds of enemy vessels at a fraction of the cost of high-altitude bombing. It strangled supply lines. It starved garrisons. It forced navies to abandon entire strategies. But numbers didn't capture the human equation. Crews who flew these missions aged fast. Combat fatigue set in early. Tours ended short or not at all. The tactic worked because men were willing to fly straight and steady while tracers filled the air around them. The unanswered question lingered long after the war ended. Did skip bombing shorten the war? Maybe. What was certain was this: on a few days, in 1943, a handful of bombers flying lower than anyone thought survivable proved that ships were no longer safe anywhere within reach of land-based air power. And once that truth was written into the sky, there was no erasing it. By the time the war ended, skip bombing had a name, a doctrine, and a place in military textbooks. But the men who proved it worked rarely spoke about it. They didn't attend victory tours. They didn't write memoirs filled with triumph. Most of them simply went home and tried to forget how close death had flown beside them at 50 feet. Major Ed Larner was one of them. He flew a few more missions after Bismarck, then stopped. Not because he was afraid, and not because he lacked orders, but because there is a point where survival becomes its own burden. He trained others instead. Watched young crews climb into aircraft carrying tactics born in desperation. Watched some of them never return. When offered continued combat command, he declined and transferred to transport duty. Supplies instead of bombs, cargo instead of fire. No one questioned the choice. After the war, the B-25 Mitchell became legendary. Museums restored a few. History books praised its versatility. Skip bombing became a footnote of innovation credited to theory doctrine and high command. The aircraft that flew at the Bismarck Sea were scrapped worn out by missions that were never meant to be survivable. Larner lived quietly. When he died decades later, his obituary mentioned his service in a single line. No mention of the Bismarck Sea. No mention of the day 9 bombers erased an entire convoy in minutes. That silence was deliberate. He had asked for it. Some victories leave scars too deep for speeches. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea never became a household name. No famous photographs, no major films. Just after-action reports, grainy reconnaissance images, and the memories of men who chose not to talk about what they had done or what they had seen others do. But the impact was undeniable. After March 1943, Japanese convoys stopped sailing within reach of Allied land-based air power. Supply lines collapsed. Garrisons starved. Islands fell not to frontal assault, but to isolation. The Pacific War began moving west one strangled route at a time. Skip bombing didn't win the war by itself. What it did was remove the enemy's ability to sustain one. It was born from failure, refined through blood, and proven by men willing to fly straight into walls of anti-aircraft fire because the alternative was letting thousands of soldiers reach the battlefield. At 50 feet above the ocean, there was no room for myth, only resolve, only consequence. And for a few minutes over the Bismarck Sea, that was enough to change history. When the Pacific War ended, the world rushed to remember the battles that fit neatly into legend. Carrier duels, island landings, famous names and famous dates. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea didn't fit that mold. It was too fast, too lopsided, too uncomfortable. There was no single heroic photograph, no dramatic surrender. Just burning ships, sinking hulls, and thousands of men lost in the water far from shore. The official reports reduced it to numbers. Ships sunk, aircraft lost, objectives achieved. What they couldn't capture was what it felt like to fly straight and level at 50 feet while the sky turned solid with steel. Or to know that once you pressed the release, you were committed alive or dead before the bomb even hit the water. Skip bombing was labeled a success, then quietly absorbed into doctrine. It became standard procedure stripped of the desperation that created it. The men who flew it were rotated home, reassigned, or killed before they could ever explain what it had cost them. Major Ed Larner never tried to correct the record. Credit drifted upward as it always does. Generals were cited, theories were praised, manuals were written. Larner didn't argue. He understood the difference between conceiving an idea and proving it at 50 feet with flak walking toward your cockpit. One mattered to historians, the other mattered to survival. The bombers themselves vanished, scrapped for aluminum, melted down, reused in a world eager to move on. No museum carries a B-25 that flew that first attack. No plaque marks the stretch of ocean where an entire convoy disappeared. And yet, the consequences remained. After the Bismarck Sea, Japanese supply convoys avoided daylight, then avoided range, then avoided sailing at all. Isolated garrisons collapsed without ever seeing an enemy soldier. The war didn't just advance, it accelerated. That is why the battle faded from memory. It proved something unsettling, that innovation born from desperation could be more decisive than overwhelming force. That a handful of aircraft flown in a way no one believed survivable could erase months of planning in minutes. And that victory could come not with glory, but with silence. The men who flew those missions didn't ask to be remembered, but history still moves on the paths they carved, low fast and unforgiving, just 50 feet above the water. In the end, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't about bombs, aircraft, or even tactics. It was about a moment when failure left no safe options and someone chose the least survivable path because it was the only one that worked. 9 bombers flew at 50 feet, into destroyers, into walls of gunfire, into a future no doctrine had prepared them for. What they proved in those minutes reshaped naval warfare. Ships were no longer safe just because they were moving. Distance no longer guaranteed survival. From that point forward, any convoy within reach of land-based air power lived on borrowed time. But history prefers clean victories, not desperate ones. It prefers admirals and maps, not crews gripping control yokes while tracer fire stitched the air ahead of them. So the story faded. The aircraft were scrapped. The pilots went home. The ocean closed over the wreckage. Major Ed Larner never tried to change that. He knew the truth didn't need applause. It lived in the empty sea lanes, the canceled convoys, the starving garrisons that never received reinforcements. It lived in the fact that after March 1943, the Pacific War only moved one direction west. At 50 feet, there was no room for legend. Only decisions, only consequences. And for a few violent minutes over the Bismarck Sea, those decisions changed the course of a war, even if almost no one remembers their names today. Long after the smoke cleared from the Bismarck Sea, what remained wasn't celebration, it was quiet. There were no parades for the men who flew at 50 feet, no speeches about the moments when tracer fire filled the windscreen and instinct screamed to pull away. The war moved on faster, now riding the advantage they had carved out of steel and water. Supply routes collapsed. Isolated bases withered. Entire Japanese positions faded without ever firing another shot. On paper, it was efficiency. In reality, it was exhaustion. Skip bombing did what it was designed to do, but it demanded a toll that never showed up in victory summaries. Pilots who flew those missions aged years in weeks. Crews rotated out early, grounded by nerves that refused to steady again. Some carried the noise of anti-aircraft fire with them for the rest of their lives. Others carried silence heavier and harder to explain. Major Ed Larner carried that silence too. He never denied what happened. He simply didn't revisit it. He trained, transferred, finished the war, and went home. When recognition came, he accepted it without comment. Medals didn't change what he had seen or the price paid, by the crews who followed him into that narrow corridor between survival and death. History often asks whether skip bombing shortened the war. The better question might be this: what kind of war did it make possible? One where supply lines could be erased in minutes, where distance offered no protection, where innovation born from desperation could collapse entire campaigns, but only if men were willing to fly straight into fire and accept whatever came next. That lesson never disappeared. It's written into every modern doctrine that assumes ships are vulnerable, logistics are fragile, and air power decides more than battles. It decides whether battles ever happen at all. Over the Bismarck Sea, the war learned that truth the hard way, and the men who taught it paid the price quietly long after the guns stopped firing.